I am thrilled to be here with you today, speaking to my colleague, Thomas Trucks, Tom, as we're more collegial with. Tom is clinical professor of Irish Studies and History at New York University. He is the author of Irish American Trade, 1660 to 1783, and Defying Empire, Trading with the Enemy in Colonial New York, among other books. But the reason I'm speaking to him today is about his brand spanking new book, The Overseas Trade of British America, a Narrative History. First of all, Tom, I held it in my hands the other day. May I commend you? It's published by Yale University Press, and what a beautiful job they did on the publication, the production end of it. But as the historian, as the person who put all those words together, congratulations.
Thank you.
How does it feel to be out on this side of the publication cycle with it?
Well, I think all young mothers would know about this. The sensation of you've been carrying this thing around with you, and it's been very close to you, and then suddenly it's not, and there's a great sense of relief and a bit anticlimactic because in order to get out, as anyone in our audience will know who has ever done a big project, forget about writing a book, just a project. Once it's done and and you're done, then you say, well, there must be something more I need to do. There must be something out there. One little last thing that I need to do, but it's a great relief, and I'm very pleased with the support throughout that I have received from the university, from Glucksman Ireland House, from my colleagues, and I couldn't ask for a better editorial team than Yale Press provided for this project. I was very fortunate to really have just excellent support. So I'm just moving on to some other things that are going to be challenging too, but this project was of long duration. I began thinking about it when Irish American Trade was published in the late 80s. I began thinking about this. And at that time, I even had a conversation with my editor at Cambridge Press about it, and they were very interested in the idea. But it took more time. This is the kind of book that takes really years and years and years to think about and put together the many pieces, because it's a book that is about a well-known subject. In fact, middle school kids in the United States, and I'm sure in many other places, know bits and pieces about it if they've read about and learned about the slave trade, if they have learned about the Navigation Acts, if they've learned about, just so many little bits and pieces. In fact, a rough estimate by me says that there's something probably close to 1,000, maybe more, books and articles touching on the bits and pieces of this subject. But what I've attempted to do, and I will leave it up to my readers to decide whether I have done that, in fact, well, I've attempted to bring it together, all of that, into a single coherent story, because I believe history must be a story. History is a story. To me, it's always been a story from the time I was a little kid. It's always been the best story. And I have attempted to write the history of the colonial American trade as a story, rather than construct it as a set of chapters on specific topical subjects, which would be things like, for example, a chapter on merchants, a chapter on ports, a chapter on specific trades, or a chapter on the slave trade. I've woven it together into an unfolding story. My first book, Irish American Trade, was a topical book. It was designed to be that. And I think in retrospect, that was the right way to do it. And it's still in print, and which I think is fine. I mean, that pretty much says it was okay. But this time, this book, The Overseas Trade of British America, that book is a core history subject, a whole core American history subject, and I wanted to make the subject as a story as widely available as I could, so that it could be understood as a story, rather than bits and pieces. Bits and pieces are great, but how do they tie together, and how do you make, how does it begin? How did it develop? What were the crises it had to overcome? And what impact did it have on the society? What brought about the crisis that led to the American Revolution, and what was the aftermath of that? And that's what the book is. It starts in the very, very tail end of the 15th century, and the early part of the 16th century, long before there was any conception of an English presence in the Atlantic of any consequence. And so it begins very, very early, and follows the story from the time of Henry VII, English King Henry VII, through into the Napoleonic Wars in the very early part of the 19th century. So it's a long, sweeping period of time, and just astonishingly busy from a historian's. Well, all periods of time are busy from a historian's perspective. So I shouldn't say this is a busier time, but it's a busy time, and when the world was being fundamentally changed. So that's what the book it is, and what I intended to do was to tell a story. And I don't have an Irish name, but I was raised in a very intensely Irish American family, but not as a kind of family that would be familiar to most of my colleagues. I mean, in the sense of urban Irish communities such as New York or Boston. Now, I was raised in an Irish American community that was small town, rural America. That a very, very different universe. So I have my O'Donnell DNA in spades, and so I was determined in telling this story that the Irish would be in the story, and they had been pretty much written out of the story by earlier historians. No, there was nothing comparable. There was no comprehensive history of the subject, but in the bits and pieces where Irish people deserved to be part of it, or they should have been part of it because they were there and they were active, they just didn't appear. And that had to do with a lot of issues and have to do with historiography in the latter part of the 19th century and parts of the 20th century, that there was just an assumption made that these people, well, they wouldn't have been part of it because of restrictions affecting the Irish economy and a string of reasons, but they were very much part of the story. And so from our perspective, meaning the Irish studies perspective, I would just say this is not a book about Ireland. It's not a book about Irish people, but it is a sweeping story in which Irish people are present, and they are active, and they are major players, as are others, as are the Scots, as are the English, of course, as are enslaved Africans, as are the various people of the Caribbean, the Danes, the Dutch, the Spanish. There's lots of players, and among those players are Irish people. So that's my story, Miriam, and I'm sticking to it.
So, Tom, if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure, because I had the pleasure of sharing an office with you for quite a while, although, yeah, I guess maybe you can see that this is a book that you just don't sit up one morning and write overnight. This is building on years of your own research in the field, and not so much even just the familiarity, I would imagine, with the historiography, but your own intellectual, that long process of mulling over these very disparate kind of types of history as you describe them, and in my pedestrian knowledge of your chronology in historical thinking, the ways in which you can kind of weave them together and bring your reader along. But if I'm not mistaken, Tom, you did initially set off by writing it more thematically.
I did.
And I seem to remember you coming in one day to the office and saying, and if I remember correctly, you'd quite a bit written, and you came in one day and I was just shocked by, you know, your discipline in terms of, like, you'd basically thrown out what you had written and you were starting again from a blank page. Tell us a little bit about that,
Well,
Tom.
that's absolutely true, and I'm really delighted that you remember that, because I may not have looked traumatized, but I had the realization that I was going to be writing essentially an unreadable book, and it would have everything in it that one would want to be in the book, but not a soul in the world would read it. And I am a believer in books, and I'm a believer in well, I'll say what I said to my students when we get into conversations about their papers and about books. I say, and then they look at me in shock. They say, how can he say that? I think that's what they're thinking, at least. And I tell them, the only thing an author should care about is the reader turning the page. If you can't do that, you're dead in the water, and you're wasting your time. You've got to be concerned about that. You have to be bringing the reader forward. You have to be telling, whether it's a topical presentation, a topical structure, whether it's a narrative history, that doesn't matter so much. What matters is you have to bring the reader along with you. You have to create something that is interesting and compelling enough to bring the reader forward. That's turn that page, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And I began thinking that way with my book, Defying Empire. Now, the same issue that you brought up relates to both of those books, but this was more dramatic. Well, that one was pretty dramatic too, but I didn't bring the drama into Ireland House. But I'll tell you about that actually in a second. So I originally planned the book with my editor at Yale Press, Chris Rogers, and I was signed in 2009, so a while back, in 2009, to do this book. And at that time, in 2006, 2007, 2000, every year, I was making a trip to London, to the British National Archives and to the British Library, and occasionally to Ireland, but most of the material that I needed was in those massive archives in London, which are very rich for my subject. And so on one of those trips in 2011, now this is after I had a plan, and the original plan was going to be topical, because books like this are typically topical, chapters on specific topics. And that's what they are. And that's what people sort of expect typically. And so I had a plan, and the plan called for 12 chapters. And okay, and I made the plan, and Chris Rogers thought this was going to work very well. And anyway, so I went forward to 2009, 2010, and now we're up to 2010, and the deeper I'm getting into the writing, I realized that this can't be done in 12 chapters. let's see, maybe we need to add a couple more, and it made perfect sense. And I remember going back to Chris and talking about it, and he said, "Well, okay, yes, and you seem to know what you seem to know what you're doing." Always a mistake to assume anyone knows what they're doing until they do it. But in any case, okay, fine. We're up to about 14 chapters now, and then I go off to London, and that in 2011, and that's when I discovered the little packet of letters that you know a lot about because you were involved in the project as pretty much my partner. And I found the Bordeaux to Dublin letters, the 125 unopened letters from the Irish colony in Bordeaux back to various places in Ireland. And the very day I found them, I was at night, I knew exactly what they were without even opening them. And I was in contact with our director at the time, Joe Lee, about the possibility of us doing something at Gluckstone Ireland House with them, and with the assistance of the British National Archives, I opened the letters, and okay, so something is set in motion there. Now that led to I'm working on a book on overseas trade of British America. And then I discover this, and then within a very short period of time, I had organized my colleagues, John Shovelin in our history department, who's an Irish lad, and Louis Cullen in Dublin, who was pretty much the reigning head person in Irish economic and social history. And we joined together, and British Academy very quickly responded with offering us a contract to have them published, which we did. Then we had an exhibition in New York. We had a conference. It was great. It was a wonderfully satisfying experience. And then that led to publication of the essays from the conference. And that's 2017. So what about the overseas trade of British America? Well, and meanwhile, I had been taking some time off and to be back at it. But then and now we're up to about 2016, 2017, when that other book was published. But now the number of chapters has gotten up to 18 chapters. Now, this has been happening over that period of time when I could work on it, but it kept and the problem was, how can you write this book if you don't have a chapter on this or a chapter on that? The problem is there's so many moving parts, there's so many pieces to the story that it's just not, and it kept expanding. And that's when I had my my moment at the edge of the cliff. Like, oh man, this is a collection of pieces that can fit together, but it'll be of interest to a specialist. It will be of interest to someone who is looking for something about that, looking for material about or understanding that particular piece of the story. But I wanted to write a comprehensive history. And so that's when I just, okay, you're just going to have to decide. And that's when I realized that it needed to be told as a story. And it needed to be rethought entirely. And so I was able to salvage bits and pieces of what I had already done. I had done quite a lot, but I didn't throw everything out. But I threw that form out, and I threw big sections of it out. But I was able to rescue enough that I didn't feel that I had wasted time really. But that was. It was a realization that, okay, now if this book is going to work, you need to think of it another way. Just come at it completely from a different direction. And I'm always inclined to want to think of history as a story. And I said, okay, why don't you that's what you should do, and just do it. And so that's why I reorganized it as a story. And then the challenge there was, how are you going to construct that story, and what's going to drive the story forward, and how should it be organized in terms of periods, which this book has 7 chapters, and I've broken it into 7 periods beginning in the early 16th century. So this is the final product is the same subject, but it's constructed in a different way, and I think this is how this version of it, I think, is how it should be done, and I've been very gratified with the response of readers to doing it this way. But I have to bring up in my book Defying Empire, I had a similar experience, but I had it in a hotel in London back in several years earlier when I was working on that book. And it was just, the problem there was this subject, which hadn't been touched. It turned out that I was being buried in archival material, and I just couldn't believe it. How could there be so much? And there's nothing written about this subject. I mean, just an astonishing number of court cases and correspondence and statutes and just even memoirs. It was enormous, just enormous what was available. And there the problem was that I realized I was being buried by a subject that how are you going to make sense out of this? There's just so much. And that and my response there was to, again, think of it as a story with a beginning, a story with moments of periods of development, and in that case, a crisis, as is also true in the overseas trade of British America, and then a resolution of the crisis. So it's the model of a story, what a story should be. How does it come into existence? I mean, how does it emerge? How does it develop? What kind of a crisis does it face? What are the consequences of that? And that was only once I began to think of it as a story, then all the pieces fell into place. Then I could organize that material as a story. And in the case of the overseas trade of British America, the same thing, more or less, is you have this massive amount of material, and how do you now then fitting it into an unfolding story line is it's always a challenge, but it made more sense. So I've had this experience twice, and in both cases it was thinking story let me take a massive amount of evidence and use it as sort it out and organize it in a kind of a roughly chronological fashion. So that's why that happened. But I was really like, I remember the day that I had the realization, either you're going to completely chuck this. I was up to 18 chapters, and my wife, Ann Ming, she would look at me and I'd tell her, I said, now we're up to 18 chapters. And she would look at me in dismay, like, oh, really? Okay. So that's why I did that. And it was believe me, it was a memorable moment when you take something you've been working on, and especially when I'm trying to make up for the time I can't say it was lost time when we worked on the Bordeaux letter project, because it was absolutely wonderful. I didn't want my opportunity to finish this book to just go away. So I had to do something. That's what I did, but it turned out to be the right thing to do, as much as.
I think, Tom, it sounds like it's all the better a book.
Yeah, I hope so.
And I think that even though I was kind of shocked, Tom,
I was shocked too.
Yeah, but it shows an intellectual maturity and confidence and comfort with the topic when you can do something like that, because you're really kind of thinking of, and that's our stock and trade, right? Consuming you know, sometimes very vast amounts of evidence and engaging with the historiography on a particular topic. And then really the model that you've used with both Defying Empire and with your new book that we're speaking about today, to render the themes and the chronology in a way that lends itself to a story arc that will not only engage the reader on that very fundamental point of like turning the page, you know.
If they don't turn the page, Miriam, it's over.
Yeah,
It's over. As much as we'd say everything's great, well, it's not so great if they don't turn the page. And so, yeah, you're completely right. You're completely right.
So Tom, let me, since we're kind of leaning into our Irish American or Irish platform here, you know, okay, the title is The Overseas Trade of British America. As a historian who's actually spent a lot of time in the office with you historically, I have some sense of the Irish kind of components to those to that context. But for our viewers today, for people engaging with the topic of the book, as I said, The Overseas Trade of British America, can you give us an example of the kind of Irish stories that we might find in a narrative of this type?
Yes, there are many, and I'll just touch on the ones that would maybe jump out the most. For one thing, it's not. It may not be apparent to all of our listeners, viewers, that Ireland was a separate kingdom from England earlier, and then after 1707 from Great Britain, when after the Act of Union in 1707, when England and Scotland joined together and created the Kingdom of Great Britain, Ireland was still a separate kingdom. So that meant that even though they had a shared monarch, and Ireland was not the only place in Europe in those years to have shared monarchs. In fact, that is I'm not going to suggest another topic for myself to write about, but that is a topic that would be very interesting, really, to explore. Is that feature that jumps out about Ireland and Great Britain in that period having shared monarchs, but there were other places in Europe that had shared monarchs too, and mostly in Central and Eastern Europe. But in any case, Ireland was a separate kingdom. And as a result of that, as a consequence of that, there were those in prominent places in England, and I'm using England when I refer to the 17th century, who saw Ireland as a threat, as an economic threat, as a rival. Now, if we do history retrospectively, meaning do history backwards, we might say, and I think many would say, well, that's preposterous. How could they think that? But history doesn't unfold backwards; it unfolds forward. And if you lived in the 1650s or the 1660s, you might very well see Ireland as a rival, as a dangerous rival, because this is the age of emerging mercantilism, and state rivalry was the norm. The great rival to England was the United Provinces of the Netherlands, the Dutch. They were the great rival. But there were those who saw in England, and not just those. The particular folks I'm talking about are those who were writing the Navigation Acts, and those who in political positions to influence the direction of the acts. And they saw Ireland as a rival kingdom, and their response was a version of the response to the Dutch, and that was, we are going to do what we can with our laws to minimize the threat, the economic threat that would come from the Dutch. It came from the Dutch, which is a serious threat to or would come from the Irish, which was a potential threat. The Irish threat was potential. The Dutch threat was there, immediate. And so what was the threat? Well, the threat was geographic. One just only has to look at a map. And these were the years, I'm talking about from the mid 1630s, let's say 1630s, through the 1660s and 1670s, even into the 1680s, mid 1680s, when the level of activity, of commercial activity in the Atlantic was skyrocketing. This is when development on the North American mainland begins to really take off. And it's the period in which the sugar revolution in the West Indies is really taking off, and the Americas are a source of immense wealth, have become a source of immense wealth and are becoming important. And if we just look at the map, we notice that we don't have to look too far. We notice that Ireland is absolutely conveniently located geographically to become a major player in this, in Atlantic trade. It's right on the sea routes. It has many natural harbors. It has abundant resources. It was a real candidate to become a major stopping off point, a major player in the emerging Atlantic economy. So this is why restrictions were placed against Ireland, and before the Act of Union against Scotland too. It wasn't just Ireland, but Scotland was not perceived as a threat. Ireland was, but Scotland wasn't. But in any case, so to understand the Irish, how Ireland fits into the story, we need to first see and first realize that the trade restrictions that were against Ireland that were put in place in the Navigation Acts, and I'll tell you specifically what they are. What they boil down to is that cargoes, by the virtue of these laws, I'm kind of going to combine them in what I'm going to say. Cargoes from North America and from the West Indies needed to be shipped directly to ports in England. And then if they were going to be sent to Ireland or Scotland, they needed to be reshipped, meaning the goods, tobacco, for example, which was the first of these major products, needed to be shipped to an English port, offloaded, go through customs, pay the taxes, then put back on a ship and carried across the Irish Sea to Ireland, which then raised the price of tobacco, and tobacco being the first mass consumer good, the first truly mass consumer good. This made a big difference because tobacco was more expensive in Ireland than it was in England, and tobacco smoking was extremely widespread in these years. This would be true of sugar. So sugar came out of the West Indies, went to an English port, taken off the ship, paid the taxes, put in a warehouse, taken out of the warehouse, put back on a ship, and taken off to Ireland, sent over to Ireland, raising the cost of sugar. So this was a grievance widely felt in Ireland that this was happening. This was a consequence of English policy, and so Ireland was disadvantaged in this regard, meaning it was disadvantaged in the primary in the primary trades that came out of British America. The primary the dominant trade throughout the whole period, right up through the American Revolution, the dominant American export was it wasn't the only one, but it was the dominant one was tobacco, and the dominant product coming out of the West Indies was sugar, and not every good. And so this is where we're going to get a wedge for Ireland now. Not every good was restricted. I don't want to become too technical in my comments, but so I'll try to avoid the technical language. But there was the laws contained a list of goods that this direct shipment to England applied to. They were called enumerated goods, and sugar, tobacco, certain dye stuffs, cotton. There's just a few. Most of the plantation goods coming out of the West Indies that had English and European markets, and out of North America, it was mostly tobacco and some dye stuff. So it wasn't everything. It was, but the big ticket items were restricted, but not everything. So that's products coming out of America, and in a minute I'll point out why it was important that the list was restricted. So coming out of Europe, European goods needed to be shipped to England, and then the same process of offloading and then being put on an English ship and taken to America. So those were like European manufactured goods had to be channeled through England. They couldn't be channeled through Ireland. They had to be channeled through England. But Irish goods, certain Irish goods, could be sent directly to America. And when one looks at, if one looks at this, it looks at the list, it appears at first sight to be highly unfair and highly discriminatory, because the goods that were allowed were servants, indentured servants, provisions. Servants, really it was servants and provisions and horses, servants, provisions, and horses. But this meant that there could be a servant trade, meaning indentured servants can go to America, and very large numbers of indentured servants did go to America. But provisions, now provisions, as it was defined at the time, would have referred to food. So Ireland, which even today, I mean, I tell my students, you could leave this classroom and be back with Irish butter in 10 minutes and we would still be having class. I mean, Irish butter is a world distributed product today, and it was a major product in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so Irish food products could be sent to America, and colonial America was a large market for imported food. So Ireland did have an edge over England or Scotland, because they were not major exporters of the same kinds of food products that could be bought from Ireland. So the very best beef, the very best packet, the best salted beef, the best butter, the best salt pork, the best herring, the best salmon, the best string of products, food products came out of Ireland and found substantial markets in America, huge markets in America. So there's a wedge for Ireland that allowed Irish merchant communities to develop in colonial ports that eventually grew to be quite substantial. Then the laws became modified, getting at the tail end of the 17th century, going into the early 18th century. Linen was allowed linen could be sent from Ireland directly to America. This was turned out to be a very, very important development for Ireland. And it was pretty much understood by the planners, by the folks who made the decisions in Parliament to set up the restrictions and where they needed them, and where they made the concessions where they needed them in Britain. The British wished to have a grip and a complete hold on the woolen trade. That was the woolen trade was the core. Wool was the core. Raw wool and woolen cloth was the core English export right through till about the third quarter of the 18th century. That was their core business, and they were not going to give it up to anybody. The Irish Woolen Act is a good example of it. They weren't going to give that up. But linen was not a core English or later British product, even though there were attempts to establish a successful British linen trade. Ireland was much better positioned to produce linen, and the agriculture was more suitable to it for a lot of reasons, but some of them were political reasons. That it was, so England and Britain, they're going to have the wool trade and don't mess with it. And Ireland is going to have the linen trade, and Ireland did. And so Ireland found one of its largest markets for linen in British America, in North America, and in the West Indies. And so there were two substantial Irish products that found huge markets in the Americas. Now, it's easy to not see this if we're not looking for it. But if you looked in any colonial newspaper, if you and NYU and other universities, these are available to students online, and they can just look for themselves. And you just go to America's historical newspapers and pick any American city from about maybe, because that's when newspapers ran big advertising, from about the 1740s right up through the American Revolution. You won't find, in fact, I should, without being going over the edge, if you have a newspaper in front of you that has advertising, shop advertising, I guarantee you will find Irish products advertised, and in multiple shops, because they're just commonplace. Then when a person went into a shop in New York, a woman went into a shop in New York to buy fabric, and she went up to the clerk and said, "Do you have any Irish?" She would have asked linen. The generic name, the common name for linen in New York was Irish. "Do you have Irish?" The guy would have said, "Sure." And he would have reached over and shown her the different weights and different qualities of linen cloth. Linen was a major imported linen was a major consumer product in America, and a major consumer product in the Caribbean. It was a light fabric that could breathe, much more suitable than wool, and cotton was just way too expensive to even contemplate for most people. Cotton was a fabric really for the elite in those years. And so America became, as the American economy grew, as the population grew, as wealth grew, and America grew to be the standard of living in America was very high for that time. And America became a large market for Irish products. The idea of the kind of American colonial mythology, we like to think, I don't know if it's not me certainly, but we Americans like to think of the image of someone churning butter and everything being done at home, and isn't that wonderful? No, the high quality butter, the best butter came from Ireland. The best beef came from Ireland. The American beef was substandard compared to it. The best packaged provisions, food products came out of Ireland. And so there's a big market. Now, that's coming from Ireland. Now, going back the other way, those restrictions in the navigation laws were aimed at those enumerated goods that were perceived in the time of the writing of the acts as being necessary for them to be shipped directly to England. But the linen business in Ireland grew to enormous proportions. But Irish farmers had a prejudice, and not just they had a prejudice on the one hand, but also very good reason also for not wanting to plant local seed. So the linen plants, the flax plants, from which linen fibers are produced, the flax plants growing in Ireland in their enormous quantities were grown from imported seeds, and colonial America became the source of those seeds. Out of just a few ports, New York, Philadelphia, Newport, a little bit, in Baltimore. Baltimore didn't emerge as a major colonial port until fairly late, but even Baltimore, but very few places, New York, Philadelphia, and some smaller ports became the source of the shipping of American flaxseed. Now, this is a humble product. Most of our viewers will know flaxseed from what's in their muffins. And there's some those little cute little brown things, and that may be flaxseed. You don't think of flaxseed in the hundreds of thousands of bushels of flaxseed. It took between 50 and 70, depending on the year, full shiploads of flaxseed to satisfy the demand in Ireland for flaxseed. And the flax seeds are tiny. And I want you to imagine how much flaxseed. The barrels carried 7.5 bushels of flaxseed. And the ships carried, the individual ships carried, small load would be about 300, and a big load would be about 800 barrels of flaxseed. And we have, as I said, 50 to 70 ships a year. So Irish flaxseed trade was the largest winter, because it was a winter trade, was the largest winter trade out of the major colonial ports. And it had to be winter because the flaxseed was harvested at the end of the summer. The flaxseed the flax stems had to be dried and then shaken out, and the seeds cleaned and barreled, and they were shipped up, down many rivers and streams and collected in secondary ports, and then sent to New York and Philadelphia, where they were the main places. So it was a big business, and it required a lot of coordination, and that led to the emergence of Irish merchant communities in New York and Philadelphia that became very prominent in colonial life in those places. In New York, there were young Irish guys mostly who came over to represent family interests. Dublin, many of the ports in the north, in New York, for example, Cork was represented, Dublin represented, Sligo, but then Belfast, Newry, and Derry, and those ports, mostly because flax was mostly grown in the north. Not all flax was grown in the north, but the concentration was there. The main importing ports were in the north, along with Dublin, Cork, and Sligo in the west, and some minor places too, some other places too in Ireland. But the point is, it had to be managed, and so there were young Irish guys who were energetic and hardworking and very, very ambitious, and they came over and made tons of money. These are not suffering people. They came over and really were important players. And in New York, by some alchemy, never been able to get to the bottom of it, they tended to attach themselves. They attach themselves to the local elite political class, the New York / Dutch political class, and many of them married into wealthy New York families. In Philadelphia, they didn't do that. In Philadelphia, they did not attach themselves to the local, to the elite political class, but because Philadelphia politics was very different, and there was a deep division there between the Quaker proprietary old guard and a kind of rising, more entrepreneurial group. And the Irish merchants there tended to not attach themselves to the old guard at all. So they didn't. So we don't find in Philadelphia marriages into the governor's family and marriages into the families of the members of the council or into the wealthiest elite families in New York. We find that in New York, I mean, as in Philadelphia, we don't find it. In New York, we do. And so when the American Revolution takes place, Irish in Philadelphia are prominent players in the revolution, and we find various military, and some of them rise to prominent positions in the military. Some of them rise up rapidly in Pennsylvania politics and in the politics of the new United States in the Revolution, and they become the American patriots. And in New York, they're typically loyalists. But these communities were vigorous and prominent, and they also in New York they play a central role in my story of trading with the enemy in the 7 Years' War, because New York, that was a New York City wide conspiracy driven by these young, ambitious, hardworking Irish guys. So there's an Irish, a prominent place for Ireland and the Irish commercial network in the story of British America, because one of the British trade restrictions, one of the consequences of British trade restrictions on Ireland was, well, we have, because they were limited restrictions, we had doors open, to make it possible for Americans for Irish businessmen to make their way in America and be quite successful. And when I say it's North America and the West Indies, there were Irish communities in all of the major West Indian ports. And that is the French ports, the Spanish ports, and the Dutch ports, and even some representation in the Danish ports. because as trade, one of the consequences of trade restrictions was to encourage people to go around. Okay, we can't go through the front door, so we're going to go through the back door. And so there are lots of ways in which Irish people became connected through the Dutch Atlantic, the Spanish Atlantic, the French Atlantic. So we see Irish enclaves in all the major Atlantic French ports. We see them there's a little community in Rotterdam. In fact, Rotterdam and being the Netherlands were the state religion was Calvinism, but we find a version of the Dutch church, but we find Catholic enclaves there. We wouldn't, a small enclave in Rotterdam, which was really something one might not expect, but we see Irish trading enclaves throughout the Atlantic that have a connection to the Irish Atlantic presence, which goes well beyond British America. But the restrictions placed on Irish trade to North America, to British North America and to British West Indies, encouraged a much wider participation in the Atlantic world across national borders. So it's I'll put it this way: you would find very few places that are vital centers of trade in the Atlantic world in the late 17th century and the 18th century up to the American Revolution where you would not find in Irish presence. It was widespread, and their role in the English and British dimension is illustrated in my story, in the Overseas Trade of British America, because I wanted, one of my principal goals in doing this book was to make sure that groups, particularly the Irish, that had been, I don't want to go to the extreme of saying intentionally left out of the story, but they were left out of the story, and they needed to be back in the story. So they're there. So I don't know. That's a long answer to that question.
No, but it's fascinating, Tom. And I think for people watching and listening along with us today, such a great snapshot as to the backstory and the narratives that inform the overseas trade of British America, a narrative history, which on first glance, we may not, if we're not familiar, you've laid out so nicely there, and that intersectionality of the Irish. Tom, congratulations again. I can't wait. It's on my book stand for the winter break to get stuck into. Really gives me a lot of personal pleasure to remember that day you came in saying you had thrown out what you had written, and you brought in a copy. I'm waiting on my own copy, but it was lovely to hold a copy of it in the office the other day. And congratulations to everybody at Yale University Press. And thank you for taking the time today, Tom, to sit down and allow me with this conversation to share with the wider world the context of this wonderful new book and contribution to the historiography.
So thank you very much. I do appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay.